From a mind-blowing adventure in the jungles of the Congo to a bizarre childhood friendship that should probably be forgotten, these are the craziest stories told on Joe Rogan's podcast. Over the course of his career, the comedian and UFC commentator Joe Rogan has managed to book some of the most interesting people on the planet to interview on his podcast. As a result of those insightful and sometimes wild conversations, the Joe Rogan Experience has become the #1 podcast in the world, entertaining over 12 million listeners every month. From field-leading scientists to award-winning actors, Joe's talked to everyone worth listening to. And a fair few of those guests have shared some wild stories, the kind where you have to ask yourself, what the heck did I just hear? Crazy stories come from crazy lives, and when it comes to experiences that will blow your mind, David Cho has had enough for 10 lifetimes. The artist, podcaster, actor, and former journalist is an interesting character, to say the least. And in his first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience in episode 1518, Cho shared enough crazy stories to make a whole video about. But for today, we're going to focus on the craziest of them all, getting lost in the jungle while searching for a dinosaur in the Congo. No, you didn't hear that wrong. This guy went to the jungle in search of a brontosaurus, and let's just say he was woefully unprepared for what he'd find there. Cho describes how when he was 18 years old, in the year 1994, he was working on a kibbutz in Israel. Considering that he was born in Los Angeles to Korean-American parents, there's a whole other story on how he ended up in Israel in the first place. Anyway, the young Cho was working on this kibbutz, and while there he came across some books describing how scientists and archaeologists had spotted a brontosaurus-like creature deep in the jungles of the Congo. Restless and forever plagued with an explorer's spirit, and can we add, maybe a little dumb, Dave decided to take a 3-day one-way flight to the Congo on small, rickety airplanes laden with goats and chickens. When he arrived there, he found a country in the midst of a civil war and the first Ebola outbreak. And it was at this point that Cho realized that he may have made a grave mistake. With no phone and no internet, he befriended a young German tourist, and together they ventured into the jungle in search of this dinosaur, with no plan, no guide, and no map. As you can probably guess, they immediately got lost, and over the next few days the pair fell out, ate through their food, and it became obvious that certain death was imminent. Cho relays how one night, he came within inches of killing his partner in the jungle before he had a change of conscience and thought better of it. Having lost all hope, Cho resigned himself to dying in the jungle. When completely out of the blue, and to their luck, the young pair were found by a pygmy tribe who fed them and helped them find their way out of the jungle. They told Dave that they'd seen the dinosaur he was looking for, but when they relayed the treacherous route he'd have to take to go see it, he decided he'd enough of the jungle for one adventure. Cho's life was certainly crazy, but this next guest's life was just as much of an anomaly, but definitely more depressing. In episode 1171, Rogan sat down with Nick Yaris, an author who spent 22 years of his life on death row after being wrongfully convicted of a heinous crime. Yaris discussed the story of his life in depth with Joe, chronicling how he came from an underprivileged background, and as he grew up, he got into increasingly worse trouble. At the age of 21, he was incarcerated for stealing a car, and while in jail, he falsely told police that he knew the perpetrator of a murder in an unresolved case, desperately trying anything to earn his freedom. His tactic backfired horribly, and after the cops discovered he was lying, they pinned the charges on him, which led to Yaris being placed on death row for the murder of a woman he had never met. He detailed the horrific abuse he suffered in prison over his time there, both at the hands of other prisoners and the correctional officers. And the only thing that kept him afloat during that time was the hope that DNA evidence would eventually exonerate him. After 22 years in prison, in the year 2003, he was finally freed after DNA technology proved that he was innocent. And despite the horrific experiences he had to suffer, Yaris was an inspiring guest on the podcast, brimming with positivity and only wishing to be a better person. When it comes to crazy life stories, I'm not sure it gets any crazier than Nick Yaris, but it's not just terrible experiences which lead to wild stories. Bob Lazar appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience back in 2019, along with filmmaker Jeremy Corbell. And on the podcast, the physicist details how he worked on alien spacecraft at Area 51. It's a wild story that starts back in the late 1980s. when Lazar claims that he was hired to work on a secret site named S4, a subsidiary location several kilometers south of the United States Air Force facility in Nevada, otherwise known as Area 51. Bob claims that he was hired to help reverse engineer alien spacecraft, and that during his time there, he encountered documents that detail how humans have been interacting with alien life for thousands of years. Lazar even detailed how he was given access and was witness to technology far beyond known human capabilities, and that in one scenario he may have even encountered an extraterrestrial. Of course, there are many critics of Bob and his claims, but Rogan let the man talk and seemed fascinated by his tales. If nothing else, it's undeniably an entertaining story. Now it seems you don't need dinosaurs and aliens for a great yarn. Sometimes all you need is a gangster father and an unwarranted expulsion. The comedian Chris DeStefano appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience in episode 1822, and during his interview, he detailed a crazy story from his teen years. A young Chris was attending a Catholic high school as a teenager, while his single mother worked in the World Trade Center. He was in class on 9/11, the day that the Twin Towers were brought down in a horrific terrorist attack. Hearing the news, he believed that his mother had died, and he understandably began crying. When a classmate made fun of him, the teenage Chris picked up a chair, breaking it over his classmate's head and knocking him out cold. He was sent home and found his mother there safe and sound, as she'd left work early that day. Despite the extenuating circumstances, the school wasn't very understanding, and DeStefano details how he was summarily expelled. When he told his father, an Italian gangster not unfamiliar with stints in prison, his father marched him down to the school to, how should we put this, negotiate a deal. Chris told how his father had a pretty tense negotiation with the principal of his Catholic school, threatening to put his kneecaps out if he didn't allow his son back in school. Interestingly, Chris's father listed his ex-wife's nagging as his primary motivation. When the principal realized he was dealing with a man very capable of the violence he threatened, they managed to negotiate Chris's return, and the future comedian was allowed to finish his tenure at the school. Talk about a dad who will do anything for his kids. There's been a fair few comedians on the JRE, and quite a few of them seem to have had unusual lives. Who knows? Maybe that's what compels them to get up on stage. In episode 1141 of the podcast, Joe sat down with fellow comedian Theo Vaughn for a lengthy conversation. And during the episode, Theo casually recounted how as a young child growing up in Louisiana, his neighbor persuaded him to bury his poop in the yard. No, I didn't misspeak, and your ears work just fine. Vaughn claims that as a 7-year-old, his neighbor Mario, who was maybe a year or two older, would poop in his backyard and make Theo bury it for him. The comedian related how he must have performed the ritual over 100 times before maturing out of the activity. And if I'm being honest, this story is crazier to me than dinosaurs in the Congo and secret alien spacecrafts combined. There's one thing for sure, and that's that Joe Rogan has had the wildest variety of guests on his podcast over the years, and sometimes it's hard to recognize that you're listening to the same show. From a mind-blowing adventure in the jungles of the Congo to a bizarre childhood friendship that should probably be forgotten, those were the craziest stories told on the Joe Rogan Experience.